This is Dinora, and today, together, we are going to solve racism.
Yes.
We've got 5 minutes. I think we can do it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Not at all. Why do you think it's so hard for people to talk about racism?
I think it's hard for some people to talk about racism.
Okay.
I think it's hard for white people to talk about racism. Who wants to be told that their ancestors were murderers and rapists and, just...
Yeah.
It's not a fun thing to hear, but it's also not condemning them as an individual for what their ancestors did.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that we're going to actually be able to move through racism in any way, I think, is to have the conversation. Let's say the conversation of police brutality and police murdering people comes up. I would say it's better to have the conversation, and if you feel like cops are always right, criminals are always wrong, you should probably say that so that someone around you can help you understand why that statement is not true.
It's wrong.
And also just to sort of see for yourself where that belief comes from. Are these just things that you think? Are these things that you've been taught? Are these things that you've experienced? It doesn't mean that every conversation you have is going to lead you to believing something else.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an opportunity to learn.
Do you think that there's a better or a different way that we can teach history?
Yeah, I think if we teach the truth, we've been teaching a one-sided view of history. We've been teaching history from a perspective of whiteness being greatness and everything else just sort of being on the side. Black history and women's history are just not taught.
Mm-hmm.
Never mind getting to Latin history, Native history. Like, we're realizing that there's so much more to know and that there are so many more wonderful examples of successful people and people who have changed the world who may not look like an older white male. And I think that's important not only for people of color and for women. I think it's important for white men to know that too.
I'm going to bring up a couple of documentaries. 13th was...
That should be required viewing.
Absolutely. For me, growing up, I definitely had these thoughts in my head that seemed harmless, but definitely came from a place of watching the news and watching how people of color were depicted. Mm-hmm. The recurring image of a black man in a hoodie being a terrifying thing, that was kind of ingrained in my conscience.
Young black men, they were called super predators. And that just got passed around and around and around. If a black man is a criminal, then he is the worst kind of criminal. If a white guy's a criminal, he was confused.
There's a million ways that people justify that. Mm-hmm. And in the other case, it's lock them up.
Yep. The idea of if a white man was caught with cocaine versus if a black man was caught with crack, equal amounts, lesser amounts, whatever. If the white guy caught with cocaine went to court, he was pretty much let off with a slap on the wrist. If the black man went into court who had some small amount of crack cocaine on them, right to prison.
One politician had said, these are our problem areas, black people and hippies. We're going to push marijuana for hippies.
Wasn't it Nixon? Wasn't that during Nixon?
It was somebody in his administration,
okay.
I think. It wasn't him specifically.
Okay.
I don't think.
And
then they said crack for like in black communities. And they introduced this drug to damage them. To ruin them.
That line in the 13th Amendment, that people were no longer allowed to be made slaves unless they were convicted of a crime. Was it something like that?
Yeah.
And then you could pretty much do whatever you wanted with people. So it was a way to make sure that slavery still existed. You hear people saying prison is the new slavery or prison is the new Jim Crow. That's real. That comes from a place of truth and fact.
Another documentary I want to talk about real quick is OJ Made in America. They show you footage of Rodney King, and they show you footage from the late 80s and early 90s with the LA riots and all this police brutality and how the chokehold was a thing back then. Meanwhile, you flash forward to today, the same issues are going on. How are we in the exact same place as almost 30 years ago?
It doesn't make sense to me, and it does make sense to me because the institutions that create the laws haven't really changed.
You just brought up that racism and prejudice are different They have different definitions.
Racism is based on a power structure. So if you are someone who is going to benefit from racism, then that makes sense. If you're someone who cannot benefit from racism, then it's not racism. You're just prejudiced. One of the things that I hear called racist all the time is affirmative action. And there are so many reasons why affirmative action is not racist. And unless things have changed over the last few years, the main people who have benefited from affirmative action are white women. Isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
Affirmative action is to help give people a leg up who have not had a leg up. White women have not had as much of a leg up as white men. So looking in terms
I don't think anybody has as much as white men.
Right, yeah. But people don't think of that. Whenever people think of affirmative action, they automatically think of people of color. And it's not
and I did. People will say, too, that affirmative action is an example of reverse racism, right? Those people who do associate with people of color say, well, you're being reverse racist.
And I want them to tell me how. Because reverse racism is not a thing.
It doesn't exist.
It's not a thing. If you're someone who has constantly benefited from the social structures and the institutions in our country and the history of our country, why not take a break and share it? It doesn't mean that white men are no longer going to be able to get jobs.
They're going to be just fine.
It's just fine. It just means that everybody else is also going to be able to work. And that actually makes for a better society because we have different types of thinkers and different types of creators working together.
People who claim to be colorblind.
Literally, if you can see and you see color.
Right.
You're not colorblind. It's like it's minimizing a part of a person.
Right. It's like muting an identity. You should celebrate that. You should celebrate those differences instead of being like, we overcame them to be friends.
Yeah, it's not a good look. And usually if you're saying that you're colorblind, you're probably saying it to someone who is not white, which means more specifically that you are not colorblind, otherwise it's not going to come up. So
I dare say maybe a couple years ago, I would have also done the same thing where you become so hyper aware of being politically correct about certain things that you come off as someone who's like trying to cover up your tracks. Like the people who start a sentence saying, I'm not racist, but...
It's going to be racist.
It's going to be racist. And trying to incorporate things that you think are a part of like another person's culture. Like everybody is an individual. They have their own experiences. Just find out what they're like. Don't assume anything.
Yeah, do it on a one-to-one basis.
If you want to know something about someone, just ask.
Yeah, they might tell you that I'm not going to answer that because I'm not a teacher today. But they might. And then you might learn something. Don't judge an entire group of people based on what you think you know about them. Because everybody in every group is different.
Do you think that people are conditioned to be prejudiced?
Yep. It would have been difficult to enslave another group of human beings without thinking that they were less than, without thinking that they were criminals, without thinking that they were sex crazed, without thinking that they were the descendants of animals. And it's easy to teach that to your children so that your children who are, then going to take on the family that you own, it's going to be easier for them.
Right.
And then they're going to continue to pass that down. Even down into the times when Black Americans were getting lynched constantly. I don't know if you've ever looked at some of those photos, but the white people that are gathered around, they're psyched about it.
Oh, yeah.
They're so proud, and there are little kids there. And that was not that long ago. So the idea that racism is over, I don't even understand how people can think that way when there are great-grandparents in those photos.
Right.
There are grandparents as children and babies in those photos who were brought up murdering Black people for sport. Then when you look at institutions of education, we were just talking about it, the history books don't say anything really positive about Black people. The only Black people you learn about in the history books are like Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, maybe Frederick Douglass for some schools.
Who's alive and well.
He's doing great. He's getting better and better.
People who are running our country need to read.
He doesn't read at all. He gets his news from Fox News. Like, that, the president is not supposed to get their news from a television station. That's just not okay.
When you're a reality star, that's all you know.
Yeah, that's true. It's taught from the time we're born. unless you have someone who comes in and says, here's why that's not true. There are a lot of people who grow up in communities that are incredibly homogenous, and you just have a group of white people who live here and a group of black people who live there, and they barely have any mixing. For those groups of people, until they have a friend or fall in love with someone who is other, how are they going to know any different?
I just kind of want to make it mandatory for everybody to move at least once so you can be exposed to these different people with these different stories and these different points of view, because I think that helps widen your empathetic embrace.
If you're allowed to believe something about another group of people and then you never actually experience that group of people, it's never going to change. Why would you know?
I'm going to bring it back to white women for a second.
Okay.
Because I am one.
Yeah.
You're not colorblind. You see that?
I see it.
Women's March happened earlier this year. Huge success. I noticed that there was a little bit of backlash towards white women because they were basically called out by women of color for being apathetic when it came to Black Lives Matter. I can understand the mentality of, I don't understand that experience, so I feel like I can't say anything about it. Do you think that is a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people just focus on the things that are going to directly affect them. Black Lives Matter is not just for black people to promote.
Right.
We should all care that there are groups of people who are being murdered, who are citizens of our country. That's not something that I think should be separate. Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that white lives don't matter. Black Lives Matter doesn't mean black lives are more important than anybody. The issue is black lives are treated as though they don't matter.
Right.
So if you believe that black people matter,
then you should stick up
then
for
you
that.
should be a part of it.
Right. As a white girl. As a basic white girl.
You're not basic.
Well, when I go to Starbucks, I feel basic. But other than that, I'm fine.
Okay.
What do you think white people specifically can do better? No. That's a long list.
Get involved. Talk to people in your community. Talk to people outside of your community. If someone says, for instance, that you have privilege and it really drives you crazy because you grew up poor and white, think about what kind of privilege you might still have. A friend of mine was a punk rock kid and had like purple hair and crazy pants and chains, and he said that he understands what it's like to, on some level, to be black or to be a person of color, because people looked at him like he was a bad guy and he grew up poor and all this. And I was like, yeah, but all you had to do was wash the purple out of your hair and put on different clothes, and nobody was going to know whether you were rich or poor. Whereas I cannot do that. No matter what I wear, no matter how my hair is, I'm always black, and I love that. But it also means that everybody's going to perceive me in that way. I think for a lot of people, it's really checking yourself, checking your thoughts, checking your beliefs and why you believe these things, because there's not much for people to do until they know what they're doing it for. A lot of that comes from stripping away the titles. If you're someone who says all lives matter, prove it. If there's a group of people who are being killed in unjust ways, if all lives matter, you're going to do something about it. You're going to go down to your precinct. You're going to get involved with your schools. You're going to have conversations with your public officials. You're going to want to find out why this group of people are being killed. Don't think about their race. Just think about them as American citizens. If American citizens are being killed at a really crazy rate, you should want to know why. If you think all lives matter, prove it.
Thank you so much for talking with me about racism today. Have conversations.
Talk about it.
Thank you, guys.